This is on, and this is mute. So it's just always this button on and off. There's two batteries in here. Four batteries. So by the time we're done tonight, I'll take it home and I'll. Then I have two other recharges.
I am the 5-year-old drawings on the whiteboard there. Yeah, instead of presenting, I just set it on my 5-year-old.
I can clip it onto me.
Yeah, just feel like.
Yeah, that's actually mine. I just have not devoted as much time as I would like to. And so a lot of that was from my head and some of it was from an email there. I didn't have anything printed out.
Trying to get notes.
I didn't print it, so, and I also, that's actually a little bit of work for me to make that happen because I don't have a printer. I didn't ever buy a printer. The occasional trip to FedEx for coffee time. We have a printer there and then pay and print.
I have a
Or
question.
sometimes I use my
How
work
do you
printer,
keep
but I try
data
not to use that.
on,
It's like one sheet of paper. I'm like,
how many
I feel like
actions
that's
have
probably
been
fine.
placed or like?
If it was like color and for this, I'm like, I feel like I'm, you gotta, sure.
Testing.
I printed out like a passport form at work and I was like,
3, 2,
well,
1.
about this, I will literally just hand $1 over to whoever hopefully is entitled to the $1.
Can you hear me?
Printing at work.
Can you hear me?
I do.
Awesome. I think this might be a good space for me.
That's my Disneyland.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, awesome. Could you also, do you have those do not sit? Oh, perfect.
It's good though.
I didn't write it down. I biked by and I remember observing the parking garage.
Do not sit.
Maybe I'm wrong.
So this works. You can hear me. Okay, awesome. Hi. Are you taking this class as a PSU student? You are. Did you take it as a pass or no pass or a grade?
I don't know. I think as a grade.
As a grade?
Yeah. I don't know.
I need to figure out how to submit grades.
Okay.
Who would know? So it is a grade then?
Yeah.
Okay. I always give more homework for students who are actually taking it for a grade. I'm sorry, what is your name?
Andrew.
You know the Andrew. Okay. It's fine. I need to know when grades need to be submitted. Is it you or even, and what's your last name?
Medlar.
Medlar. Okay, well, okay, we've been,
Yeah.
so I'm thinking, it's you, Stephanie, and another. You want to share? Yes, Andrew?
I like how she knew her history outside of her own. Like she was aware of like other demographics gone through similar situations compared to just being aware of like her own.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the things she really wanted to do was bring justice to her father, which is a hard thing to do. And her being able to share that story was one of the many ways that she could relive that past and also recognize what he had gone through and use it as an educational tool. Anything else? Yes.
I thought it was great that she brought the menu from the restaurant.
I know.
This is something that kind of, I thought that was a perfect thing to pass around to kind of like connect this to that time period.
Yeah, it's something very tactile. It was a carbon copy of the menu, and it was like one meal was 50 cents. Amazing. Yes.
I'm forgetting the speaker's name, but part of the presentation that was looking at a lot of the different modes of transit. I found it very interesting and hopeful as we have these different types of car transit that can be shared and rented, and how that can basically hopefully decrease ownership, where people move from 2 cars to 1 car, from 1 car to 0 cars, and slowly, get people away from congestion. And then maybe accepting public transit too. That seemed like a good move in the right direction. So that's.
In the smart mobility, smart city space, I think one of the things that still needs to be taught and learned and researched to all the engineers and all the planners is the space of equity and community and who you plan for, because you can get like so amazingly like in love with all this technology and all this innovation and go way forward in that, but forget who you plan for. So I want to commend you, Tristan, and a couple of others that we brought in the space of equity to really, who's this going to impact, and bring in transit, because Adrian speaks nationally on many occasions, but he didn't include the transit equity piece, which is so important. So I'm glad that you brought it up so that he can take that presentation and say, okay, I'm going to remove these slides, bring part of this hour-and-a-half conversation down to 20 minutes, but also like the equity piece in transit is really important. So thank you for doing that. Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was a gap too, but it sounded like you just referenced that he probably usually talks about it. In this class, it was weird that he didn't talk about it.
He didn't, yes, exactly. But I asked him to pare something from a 2-hour presentation down to 20.
One of the things that I didn't hear that maybe he also talks about is, so he talked about how even if not all of the cars are self-driving, a lot of them would be connected, I believe. And I don't think he touched on like privacy concerns. And I feel like that idea that even if I'm driving my car, it's connected and sending out data to all of these other cars scares me. And I think it probably scares a lot of people in different ways and for different reasons.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
One more quick thing.
Of course.
I chatted with Adrian a little after class. We all went to the bar, and
we were
talking about one of the, I think you might have been in the conversation. I had a concern about things being too smartphone focused. Not everybody owns a smartphone, and he pointed out how in one of the projects he advocated for having screens at a lot of the different transit stops, so that regardless of whether or not you had a smartphone, you'd be able to be aware of transit options. So anyway, I thought it was neat that that's something that's being thought of, and that's an equitable, albeit expensive, solution.
But not everybody has smartphones. It took me a while to adopt into that world, but it will take my parents' generation, who's older, that don't speak English, to figure out what this computer thing is all about. So demographics and who we plan for, I think, is really important. Shall we start? Oh, I have a couple of announcements and questions. Okay. The Google Drive. You guys have access to the Google Drive. So I have a sign-in sheet for the potluck, which you're invited to, December 5th. Prior to final. So what I've decided is actually have the potluck take place before class so your food doesn't go cold. So 5 o'clock, 5:30, if we meet outside, eat our meal, share some stories, and then we come in here by 6:30. We'll have our guests, which Director Chris Warner will be here, and somebody from Udaley's office will be here. And we might have a couple of other directors that might pop in by surprise who are supportive of this class and your work. So that's one thing. So sign-in sheet for the potluck, sign-up sheet for the field trip, which will take place December 14th on the Saturday. And I'm going to gear it towards the J District because Juana, who's one of our classmates, who's from Mapano, who's not here today, but she worked out a map. So we're going to do a tour. So I want to know who's going to be there, so I have a head count, and we're going to start a dim sum breakfast at 10 o'clock. So you should try to be there if you want to. December 14th is the potluck, no, the field trip, the dim sum field trip. Dim sum always brings people. Tamika, you should come back.
I do like dim sum.
Yeah. So The Google Drive also contains a sign-in sheet for your projects. And I would like for you to go in there under your name to put a title for your project. There's a column for project description and your options, but if you could go in there, go to the Google Drive right next to your name, I would like for you to fill in the title of your project. So, because I'm going to figure out your timing. Each of you will have 3 minutes, a presentation, and 1 minute for questions. And we should have enough because it looks like I have 22 students now. Part it down to 22. Manageable number? Do you have a question?
Yes, are we able to bring like a +1 or with during the field trip?
+1?
Yeah, can you bring other people with us to tag along for the field trip?
I don't see why not. If you want to bring your partner, your friends, your kids, your dog, not to dim sum. I'm not doing I have brought my dog to a field trip, a class field trip before. But it's going to be a cold day. That dog cannot go into the restaurant. May be able to go into the Upano Center because I know that I've taken Uma in there before. Yes.
And transportation is a barrier, and you live in Northeast North Portland. I
Yeah.
can fit 3 people in my car. I added carpool.
Oh, that would be
so
awesome. Thank
the
you.
spreadsheet already, so.
Yeah. Okay.
That's what I was gonna ask. Is
Okay.
If we were driving or taking transit or what for the field trip?
Yeah, I was actually going to leave it up to you because I know everybody lives in different places. If you want to coordinate with each other to get to Ocean City, I live far out, and I'm willing to take 2 people because I have a baby car seat, so I'm willing to take 2 people.
So we're only going to one place? We're not gonna,
And no, I don't think we're going to hop around. Actually, I think what we're going to do is actually go to Dim Sum, park at a nearby location there, and then walk off. I really love to walk off my food. I think it's really important that we do. Walk off your food and then tour the Jade District, and then eventually end up at the Orchards of 82nd, which is the Upano Center, around noon or a little bit after noon. But we'll figure out the time and everything. And then we can also figure out carpool. If you guys want to ride from like East Portland into 82nd, then we can try to facilitate that. Will you be coming? Yes, you will come. Okay, awesome. More questions? Anything else? So next week, sorry, give me 2 minutes. Next week, we'll have our very first time our representatives from ODOT to come talk about the I-5 Rose Quarter project. And I would like for you as your homework assignment to look at homework number 8 and also send me questions that you want ODOT to ask our guests, Shelly Romero and Megan Channel. So send those questions to me in advance. I will send it over to them so that they can prepare for your questions. Okay, today. So I think I'm in for a treat as much as you guys because we've had this whole thing nicely planned out, but I think we're going to be in is even nicer. So I will introduce our guests. So this is the first time that I've met Tamika like just within the last 20 minutes, but we've been on the phone for one time and planning this class several times on email. You may have heard of her, you may know of who she is even before I did, but Tamika is with currently now with Toole Design. She's a director of planning and also of equity and inclusion. Formerly, she had run her own firm and was the executive director of Los Angeles Neighborhood Land Trust. So we welcome Tamika today. Additionally, this class is actually brought to you by WTS. I did this last week, mainly because Tamika had come here to Portland to do a WTS talk, but then more so Sara Schooley, a colleague of mine who works for Toole, and we ran into each other at WTS event, and I said, I'm doing this class. You want to be a part of it and bring Tamika in? So we concocted this class for you. And next, so Sara will be here. She'll help facilitate the exercise. But also, my good friend is Millicent Williams with PBOT. This will be your 3rd time speaking to the class. twice from the previous course and here now. And Millicent came from the East Coast, and she's got quite a position at Peabody, taking care of a lot of their projects. And so we'll hear from Millicent. She'll talk about capital projects delivery methods, and we'll bring in community engagement, we'll bring in equity. And I'm gonna hand it over to Tamika so she could talk about this afternoon, or this evening's presentation and class exercise. This is the first time I'm using this. So just put this onto you.
Okay. I can't outsmart the thing. This is not good.
Perfect.
Okay.
Hold on to that.
Perfect.
There you go. You have the floor.
All right. How's everybody doing? I'm really happy to be here, despite the fact that it's very cold compared to LA. But thanks for having me. We have what we think will be an engaging evening setup for you. We are switching things around a little bit. We wanted to start with an activity. It seems like, you know, you've been going through this class and you've had a lot of really engaging and awesome speakers come in and talk to you, but we want to start off by having you do something first and actually get to engage with one another. And so the way class is going to work tonight is my colleague Sara is going to come up and explain an activity that we're going to have you all do. We're going to have you split into 2 groups and then spend some time together thinking through some questions. And then we're going to come back together as a full class, and we're going to ask you all to share out what you talked about in your group. So make sure when you do get in your groups, spend some time saying hi to each other, maybe come up with the team name and decide who's going to be taking notes, who's going to be sharing out. And then after you all share out, Millicent and I are then going to talk about our day jobs and what we do every day, and how some of the things you all talked about in your activity through an exercise actually show up for us every day in our transportation work, and how you can start thinking about those things when you're thinking about transportation projects that maybe you're interested in, or transportation professions that you might be interested in, or just things you're curious about. So we're going to have you all do some creative thinking first, and then we'll bring it back with practical knowledge. And then we want to end with a ton of time for just Q&A for you all to be able to ask us any questions you want. And we will commit, actually all 3 of us will commit to being open and honest and answering as many questions as you have. Are there any preliminary questions before we get started? Okay, well then I will pass the mic and clip to Sara.
This is funny. So my moonlighting gig is I'm a cycling instructor. So usually I have like a headset mic. So this is kind of fun, something a little different. So my name's Sara Schooley. I'm also with Toole Design with Tamika, and I'm here out of the Portland office. I'm a project planner there. And so a lot of my work does involve transportation planning along with community involvement. And before I was at Toole, I was the pedestrian coordinator at Peabody. And I think Michelle has or will be coming.
Michelle.
Yeah. No, she's not. Never mind. Just kidding. Just kidding. She's great. You should go find her. So one of the things that we wanted you to think through today is a couple of real life on the ground City of Portland projects. And we want you to think about kind of who they impact and the history of kind of how they got there. And then also start thinking about different ways that the project could be improved. And so, as you've probably talked about, it sounds like in some of the previous classes, a lot of the conversation about transportation and the progress in transportation has to do with who kind of has the decision-making power, who the project is done for, and where those benefits and burdens kind of come out on the other end when a project happens. So there's never a project that is like great for everybody. There's always some sort of balance that happens. And so Millicent has 2 projects for us that we're going to kind of talk through to see who got the benefits, who got the burdens, how does that flush out, thinking about the different populations, the different modal users, and the different historically underrepresented communities that are here in Portland. So I have a list of questions that I put together, and I'm just going to read through them, and then we'll turn it over to Millicent to describe some of the projects. And what we'll do, as Tamika said, is we're going to split you into 2 groups. So it looks like fairly even-ish. We just want to kind of make this half one, this half the other. And we have, I guess, 4 questions about the project. The first question is, who asked for this project and why is it happening? And so this really talks to kind of who has the power in this situation. Who is this project for? And so the next question gets a little bit deeper into that, who is that project for? And I have these all written out, so you don't have to copy them down or anything. Digging into who is this project for, we're going to talk about who will get the benefits of the project and who will be impacted by the burdens of the project. So kind of implicit in that question is identifying what are the benefits and what are the burdens that come out of the project. And then kind of thinking about the who gets the benefits and who gets the burdens, I want you to think a little deeper about who that who is. So who are they as far as race, demographics, age, kind of who are those groups that are kind of getting those burdens and those benefits. So the next bigger question is, how did community involvement reach underserved communities? And I think the key actually is the second part of the question, which is how did the feedback from this involvement change the project outcome? There was some presentation we had at Toole Design a while ago where they never say, like, you're outreaching to your grandma. Like that's not a verb you use when you're like, I really want to get somebody's feedback. I'm going to ask my grandma for advice. You're never like, I'm going to do outreach. And so we want to really think about how did that outreach get information and bring it back and change the project and figure out if it did or if it didn't. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about what are the opportunities to improve the equitable outcomes in the project. And so sometimes, no project is perfect. And Millicent has 2 projects that are ongoing right now. So it's actually a really interesting time to be talking about them to see kind of if there are tweaks that could be made in the process that could help reach the more equitable outcomes. Do all those questions make sense? Yes? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Millicent, and while I do that, I'll hand out the questions.
So, good evening, and who loves to have projects disrupting their lives? Because that's what we have going on right now in Portland. This is not doing the thing. I guess if I would just calm down. Okay, there we go. So we've been very busy at the Portland Bureau of Transportation. We've had a rush of opportunities to make improvements to community. And with that opportunity, and by opportunity I mean a great deal of funding over the past several years, we've been able to be, in many ways, very strategic about the work that we're doing. But in many ways, we've also had to be responsive to the ongoing needs that we have about ensuring that our infrastructure is serving everyone. So something that I'll talk about when I get into my presentation later is there are assumptions around how transportation projects are funded and assumptions around what a transportation bureau should be doing to ensure that infrastructure is in fact existing and serving everyone that it's intended to serve. Many places have something called taxes that cover the expense of paying for roads and striping and bike lanes and sidewalks. And while the city of Portland does impose taxes upon people, and through property taxes, people will say, I pay property taxes. Why don't I have the thing that I want? Because out of a $3,000 tax bill a year, about $17 goes to transportation. And so that's why you see things like a gas tax, and you see things like other fundraising efforts going on to ensure that we're able to do what we do as it relates to building infrastructure for communities. So there are 2 projects that we're going to be discussing tonight. Some of you may be familiar with them, some of you may not, but I will give a brief overview of each of them so that I can ground you in the community that's being served, or the communities that are being served, as well as the outcomes and objectives that we have intended. Maybe I'll leave that as a secret for you to figure out what we intend. But some of the ways that we intend to move the project forward. So the first project, who lives in Southwest Portland or West Portland or the new South Portland? You know, it's going to be changed to South Portland soon. Oh yeah. So who then is familiar, and this may not just be a Southwest Portland thing, who then is familiar with Southwest Capitol Highway major mega project? Okay, good. So that's a $25 million investment that is going to be about a mile in length along Southwest Capitol Highway, and it's going to do a number of things. And we can pull that website up, and if you have smartphones, I know you're not supposed to use your technology. I was also supposed to have printed out a synopsis of each of the projects, but I didn't, so I'm saving trees. That's what we're going to go with. But it's a project that is providing sidewalk, that's providing bike infrastructure, that is repaving a very critical piece of infrastructure in that it's heavily traveled, but the topography is such that it does not always allow for us to do the amount of work that we would like to do. There are stormwater concerns, there are drainage concerns, and we're working to address all of that. We're working to address safe routes to schools. We're trying to ensure that this stretch of the city's infrastructure is well treated and well served. And so that's one of the projects that we're going to be working on. So it is a project that's funded by 3 bureaus. And in fact, the Bureau of Environmental Services and the Water Bureau are paying into the project more than PBOT is by a significant amount. But the project management is occurring out of our office. And part of the reason for that is, just in case you didn't know, there are just as many sewer and sanitation projects going on right now as there are surface transportation projects, but you don't see those. And so since you don't see them, you don't know they're happening, and you don't get to call and complain about them the way that you do about the transportation projects. So we are leading that effort because we're the most visible component of this project. And there are a couple of other things as well. So that's one project. And so I'm not sure who wants to, yes?
When you say West Portland,
Mm-hmm.
what do you mean? Where is it?
Not east, west of the river, but I am talking about the Southwest Hills on up towards PCC Sylvania campus, that area near Barber Foods. Yeah, so that's right, exactly. But before it gets to I-5. So there's another project that's going to take care of that little interchange there. We can talk about that later too. There's tons of projects. There's only about 225 that are going on right now, just in case anybody's wondering. So, when I say Southwest Portland or West Portland, that's what I mean. That's the area that I'm talking about. So that's a main thoroughfare there, and one half of the team will be working on that. And there will be some questions that are on your list that you will think the answer is one thing, and I'm going to encourage you to think more broadly about the response. Because what we're finding as we're doing our work is that some of the assumptions that we're making about communities and the demographics within communities and who's being served and who's not being served and who's being harmed and who's not being harmed, those things are being challenged every day. So it's forcing us to think differently about our work, and I'm encouraging you to cause us to think even further or be even more challenged by the work that we're doing based on the questions that you ask. So that's one project. The second project that we're going to ask that you consider is not Williams. Williams is done. We can talk about that one later. It's a safety project. It's the Outer Division Multimodal Safety Project. So who lives in East Portland, Southeast Portland, far Southeast Portland? Okay, off of Division. So there is a safety project that's going to be implemented in Southeast Portland between 82nd and 122nd. There's going to be a great deal of work that's being done because right now speeds are too high, crashes are too frequent, people are not able to get to and from places dependably no matter which mode they're using. And so we're wanting to make sure that we're addressing all of those challenges. It is a Vision Zero corridor. As we know, there are a lot of people who used to live in inner Northeast or in inner North Portland who have been, for any number of reasons that we can talk about shortly, been relocated, been displaced, felt compelled to move to some of the more affordable parts of town. But when they moved, they were met with infrastructure that did not necessarily meet their needs. And so with the growth in that community, we're looking at several corridors that need to have very, very specific and intentional attention given to them. But Outer Division is one of the first ones that we're going to be working on. It was and is a contentious project for any number of reasons, some that you will uncover here, some that we will discuss further once we come back together as a group. But it is an important corridor and an important project. And so we're wanting you to step through the paces of those questions so that we can make sure that as we are continuing to wrap up design, as we're continuing with the outreach, there's an open house tonight that if I were not here, I would be there. So would we. And it's connecting, this project is connecting with the Division Transit Project. So it's a massive stretch that's presenting opportunities for us to think differently about how we do our work. So those are the two projects, Southwest Capitol Highway, Multnomah Village to the other place, and Outer Division to West Portland, and then the Outer Division Multimodal Safety Project. So if you have your smartphones, you can pull it up. If you have access on your computers, you can pull those up. There are a lot of details that obviously I have not discussed. The Outer Division project costs about $13 million, and Southwest Capitol Highway costs $25 million. And you can even discuss the reasons for that as a challenge as relates to communicating around projects. And I do want to challenge you to think, as you're talking about even the cost of projects, just because something costs more in another part of town doesn't mean that someone's getting more. So we'll talk about that as we talk about how we build projects, how we plan projects. Just because a project is $25 million in one part of town doesn't mean that we're not spending an equitable amount of money in another part of town based on topography, based on stormwater needs, based on historical maintenance of those roads. So those are the two projects. We're going to give you some time, 15 minutes or so, to work in your groups. This group will be the Southwest. Who lives in Southwest? You do. Okay, so it doesn't matter then. I was going to say if there were more Southwest folks on this side, then I would have said East Portland on this side. So this side will be the Southwest Capitol Highway group. This will be the Outer Division Multimodal Safety Project group. And go.
How about we reconvene at 7:35?
Perfect.
Second. Okay.
Hang out with the Southwest. Sure. Zoom over and I'll answer questions there because we can be the outer division.
Okay.
Pretty much.
So we're gonna send somebody to each of the groups, and if you have questions or if you need to know a little bit more about any of the projects, there will be someone who can answer those questions for you.
Do you want to rearrange or just kind of?
Yeah.
So is everybody ready to go? Oh. Okay, ready to go? Ready to go? I love that conversations are still ongoing, and keep some of the questions that you have in your head for the end of class. Okay. This side all ready to go? Okay, yeah, that's the spirit. So I know this side that I was listening into, we didn't necessarily get to all the questions, but one of the things that was mentioned was how just kind of learning about the project was really useful, projects that you haven't heard of, and just kind of hearing about the process of how projects get done. So for this side, because I want to give Tamika and Millicent enough time to talk and have the Q&A at the end, I'm just going to ask for kind of a couple aha moments that maybe you had during the discussion about any of these questions. So were there any times during the discussion where you're like, I hadn't thought of it that way, or this is a really interesting way that the project got done, or this is what changed the project, made the project, breaking the project, any of those?
I don't know, I guess as far as like, we were kind of stuck on the equitable outcomes because it seems like whether or not this change happens, there's going to be inequities coming from it, but also equities coming from it. It seems like you can't win either way. Like we talked about, if we slow down traffic, that's going to be like an inequity. People who are already like extremely burdened for time might have to go from job to job, or like job to daycare to pick up their kid or something.
Mm-hmm.
And if it already has a lot of congestion, maybe like it might be more inconvenient for those folks.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, it's like it's promoting equity too, because it makes it safer for people who don't have vehicles across the street without risking their lives. So
Mm-hmm.
trade-off.
Yeah. And and I don't know, Twee, if you got to this, in the project, how are those discussions happening in outreach? I think that's really where a lot of these discussions end up in. How do you know how they're kind of answering those questions? You didn't know that. And I don't know if Twee and
Open house, which is
Oh,
taking
yeah.
place today as a result of the Division Transit project.
We try not to focus on the transit,
Right.
rep transit, because I thought that was kind of like a.
That's maybe an example of one type of outreach for a
Mhm.
project like this is an open house.
Yep.
Did they do open house?
Yes,
Yeah,
There is.
we did a lot
I
of,
assume so.
we did a lot of open houses. We did a lot of business outreach. That one was a really hard project because of the character of that corridor. So the design reflects directly what the business community needed and expressed a concern around as it relates to access, because we are putting in a median, which means people can't just turn anywhere all willy-nilly. But certainly it makes it safer, but the concern was, well, nobody's going to go down to this light, make a U-turn, you're restricting U-turns, they're going to have to go through the community. It was great. It was fantastic to try to get to outcomes on that. But we had a lot of both large-scale community open houses and then smaller group meetings with individual organizations, stakeholder groups, folks who we knew to reach out to, and others who we didn't know to reach out to, we were recommended that we reach out to.
there's been joint open houses with the Peabody.
And we've had several of those.
That's kind of what we were talking about, especially as we were discussing the median. It sounds like the median became a very wide mix of use, that there were raised medians for crosswalks and pedestrian traffic. There was tree medians for where you wanted to restrict access, and yet there was also left lane traffic for the isolated areas where the local business actually needed that kind of access. So it looked like it was limiting as much as possible creating safety for pedestrians while leaving pockets of open access.
That's the plan. That's the
How
plan.
well that outcome comes,
We are going to continue to, even after the project, as the project's being built and after the project is built, continue to educate and provide encouragement programs for people to figure out how to best use the system. I know that sounds perhaps weird for folks, but there's trepidation around some of the changes that we are implementing, and people want to be instructed about how to traverse. There are, and we talked about it on this side, there are right-of-way things that are conversation pieces around the Division Transit Project, and people's assumptions around space and use of space and what is theirs and what is not to use. And it's interesting how when you take things away that don't belong to people, they're very upset.
I'm aware.
You're aware. Yeah. Well, mixed reviews. One of the comments that I made on this side was for this project, for the Southwest Capitol Highway project, many folks in the community felt like this project was being done for them. Many of the projects that are on the east side of town, and you can start as close in as Burnside and Sandy Couplet, Williams, Vancouver, Martin Luther King, 7th, 9th, and you go on to 82nd, and you go to 162nd, 122nd, Halsey, Weidler. Those projects, many of the people that we've heard from Foster, have Outer Powell, which is an ODOT project that we're working with them on, feel like the project is being done to them. So it's a 4 versus 2, and the argument is we're not riding bikes. You're doing these lanes for people who are not using the facility. So you're taking space from what would be a route that we would be able to drive on and repurposing it for a bike, and nobody's using it. There are those among us who believe that if you build it, they will come. There are those of us who remind them that that is not necessarily the truth. But what we are hoping to do in all of our projects is to build a multimodal system that allows for equal opportunities of use for every user, and creating those spaces as safely as we can. So in the case of the Division Transit Project, we are putting up buffers in certain parts along the route for the bike lanes, not full buffers, not full medians, you'll be able to get in there, but the delineators help around safety, because people are now looking for maybe a backwards way of thinking about it for some, but when you put something in the way, people pay attention. So if you put a rapid flashing beacon, you put a median, you put a delineator, you put a diverter, people do pay attention to whatever's in there. And so the hope is that it would help to reduce serious and fatal crashes.
And Millicent, I want to jump in for just a second, because I think this conversation of two and who the project is being done to versus who the project is being done for, these are two really interesting projects picked because of that. So I was wondering if somebody on this side could explain a little bit why this project was more of the project is being done for instead of the project was being done to, acknowledging that most of you just learned about the project 15 minutes ago. Yeah.
We've heard that the Multnomah Neighborhood Association, which is strong, has a lot of presence there, was basically in favor of it, as well as were the Multnomah Village Business Association folks. Mm-hmm. So it would be having those two community groups basically on board. I think there were certain merchants that weren't happy about some of the restrictions, but those are two players in the community that you would want for you rather than against you, and they were on board.
Mm-hmm. And maybe also that the community had been asking for it for, you said 20 plus years, and that even till recently they didn't think that it was actually going to come to fruition. So the idea that it's finally happening, something we've asked for all these years.
But on the division transit, I mean, the division, outer division multimodal project and all the other, many of the outer east projects, people have been asking for lights, and we haven't done that. And so now we're putting in all this new facility and bikes, and they're like, we asked you for lights for 30 years, and now you're putting in bikes. Who is this for? So
Yep.
I'm
And,
being a little bit.
and I also think kind of going further, thinking about the who is it for, thinking about the demographics and the history of people who things often get done onto versus who things get done for, that this could just seem like you're doing another thing onto us, versus this community that we talked about on this side of the room that has been asking for it for 25 years. And also that the project, while it increases bike and pedestrian infrastructure, it doesn't really do that much to decrease or cause the burdens to those that are driving through the area and will continue to drive through the area, where it sounds like this project is definitely trying to kind of restructure the modal behaviors and the ease of getting through an area. You had a question?
Oh yeah,
Comment?
just one of my aha moments as I was doing research on the project is that it's interesting to see the keynote speakers at the neighborhood association meetings in that area.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like commissioners, like the Portland commissioner will be there, and other high leadership that communicate directly with the community. But I'm not sure if that's happening at any other projects besides that one. So that was like my aha when doing that.
Great, thank you. And I think we probably need to get to, right, was it?
Yeah.
One more? Okay, one more. Yeah, go
I
ahead.
see in this southeast, or on the division project, there's speed cameras. And it seems like there's punishments if you don't follow the rules on the east side. But I don't know if there's speed cameras, I'm assuming.
The unfortunate reality is that the higher speeds streets are in East County because they used to operate as highways. And so you just don't have the frequency of high speed challenges in other parts of town. We've had that conversation a great deal about the equity as it relates to the speed cameras, because yes, the enforcement is there. And if there's a camera there, or if there's someone there, then yes, you'll catch it. If there's no camera, then there's nothing to catch, or you assume. But again, everybody that lives, not everybody, but many of the people who live in those areas where the monitoring and the enforcement is being done fall into one of several categories that whether they're underserved, lesser served, minority communities, immigrant communities, those are where the impacts are and where the enforcement is happening. So there are very serious fundamental questions about how we do that and why and where and what that looks like that continue all the time. But we recognize that it on its face and perhaps reality, people are being treated unfairly just by that enforcement action that's happening. Yeah.
Is Highway 10 an exception then? The Beaverton Hillsdale Highway has a bunch of speed cameras, doesn't it?
It is there's just not as many. Yeah. There's not as many roads like that in other parts of town. Even North Portland until you get out further. A Columbia Highway perhaps, but by the virtue of their name, they're highway. It's not Columbia Road. Yeah. So.
Okay, so I'm gonna wrap this up so you guys will be able to get about a 7-minute break before you get more the lecture than the Q&A part of this class. But I'm hoping that even if you didn't get to all these questions, it just helped you think about kind of looking at the other side of the project and kind of assessing them from more of a human perspective, especially thinking about the benefits and burdens. This discussion, at least the Q&A that we just had, didn't really get into the demographic factors too much of kind of the individual projects and who are the ones receiving the benefits or the burdens of those projects. But that's another really large component to figuring out whether the project has an equitable outcome and how those groups were involved in community involvement. So hopefully as you are working on your projects or tracking transportation projects as they happen through the city. Try to keep those questions in mind as you go forward. So with that, let's take about a 6-minute break. Meet back up here at 8. So stretch your legs and come on back.
Millicent, I have to ask you about your name.
Yeah.
Nice
I know who's who. I forget who's who next.
I don't know if I can ask for her first to just finish off this conversation.
So with this.
I'm happy to go first, but does it make more sense with flow since we just did this?
Yeah, sure. That's probably.
I love that. We just put cars. Yeah, because I live
Regular here.
This thing.
Okay, there. There we go. Okay. I did, thank you. Am I on? Okay, just give me the high sign. I'm that one, yeah. All right. All right, folks, so we're gonna get started again. I'll talk for about 8 or so minutes, maybe 7. I can try to squash it into 7 minutes and leave about 3 for some quick questions before I hand off to Tamika. But as has been mentioned, or as you might have surmised based on the conversation, I am responsible for the Capital Delivery Division for the Portland Bureau of Transportation. So we have about 20 or so folks who are leading projects. Each of the project managers has between 8 and 15 projects that they're managing. Some of the projects are as small as a $5,000 marked crossing on up to a $25 million bridge project, or in the case of the major projects team, Southwest Corridor Light Rail, Burnside Bridge replacement, Gideon Overcrossing, some of those things. So everything from soup to nuts, and that's, as I said, crossing, safe routes to schools. We're spending marijuana tax money to do work. We're spending fixing our streets money to do paving. Any and everything you can imagine. We're doing retaining walls, we're doing bridges, we're doing it all. But what I would like for you to walk away from this conversation understanding is that we do have a great deal of money right now today. We have not always had that, so we've had to do a great deal of work to build capacity to deliver projects. And in fact, my position didn't even exist for about 5 years because there was no resource to support the role. When I got to PBOT just under 3 years ago, there were 7 project managers, and I mentioned we have 21 now. So we're busy, we're doing a lot of stuff, and we are defining the work, we're aligning the work with the expectations of community, and as well as with the city leadership. We're committing to community to make sure that we're doing what we need to do, and then we're producing. But there are opportunities and challenges that come with that production that we will talk about. So is there a clicker? I don't know what to do. Okay, so that's perfect. So maybe I'll have 30 seconds of slides. So I don't know if you had this conversation, but we have a new strategic plan that's helping to govern our work for the next 3 years. The title of it is Moving to Our Future. We are focusing on 3 major goals, and they are coming up in just a second, but one of them is safety. One of them is moving people and goods, and then asset management. So those are our pillars to ground all of our work in, and all of our capital projects, while they may not always look like they're attending to all of those needs, in some way, shape, or form are. And so that's the strategic plan. But undergirding all 3 of those components is our commitment to transportation justice, which is, I know, a lot of what you've been talking about in terms of equity and inclusion over the course of the past several weeks. But our question is always, no matter if it's a striping project with a bike lane, or if it's creating a buffer zone for a bus pad, or it's a bridge. Will it advance equity and address structural racism? And will it reduce carbon emissions? So we are committed to that work. All of those things are questions we ask ourselves and ask ourselves of the project every day. So we can go back one. So we were talking about the Outer Division project. This is, let me go up to the I hate PowerPoints. I'm very bad at it. Capital project is a project that maintains or improves a city's asset or its infrastructure. So my team does not do potholes. We see them, but we are not responsible for filling those. That is something that maintenance operations does. Our team does the more strategic work that needs to be planned over a course of several months to several years to improve infrastructure. So this is the Outer Division multimodal project, not something you may have seen on the website. These are different pictures. This is what it looks like now. So you see it's a 5-lane highway with bike lanes and parking on either side. Once it's done, there's going to be a median. You'll have 2 lanes and a bike lane and some parking in some spots. And so it doesn't completely change it, but it does change it in a way that will cause people to pay more attention to what they're doing. Likewise, you see the 5 lanes with the 2 bike lanes and parking on either side. This one, parking is going to be completely removed here, bike lane, buffering, striping. Some of these will have the bus lane markings to ensure that people are using it as they should. And we can talk about bus lanes if you want to later. But so that's what a capital project looks like. I mentioned we have about 200 active projects. This year alone, $250 million of projects. But the hits just keep on coming. Okay, we can go to the next one. All right, so this is Foster Road. We talked about Foster Road briefly. I didn't put any before. If I did put some before, I would have probably put the picture with the furniture store that said, keep Foster Road the way it is. Millicent's commentary on that. A road reconfiguration is not what's causing a furniture store to lose business, because most of us don't walk off the street and say, hey, I'm going to buy a new dining room set today. Wayfair.com is what is causing a furniture store to lose business. So, but we do hear a lot of concerns and complaints around the work that we're doing and its impact to business. And so we are very intentional about how we engage around that. But this is what the new Foster looks like for those of you who've used it. Hopefully you found it a pleasant experience.
It is great. It provided a left turn lane for me in the morning.
Perfect.
Going into work.
Perfect, perfect, perfect. So that's Foster. Okay. And we are, this side talked about Southwest Capitol Highway. This is what you will see now if you were to drive down Southwest Capitol Highway. You see people walking on the side of the road. You see craggy stuff going on over here. This person will probably lose this fence. These people will probably lose these trees. But this is what the improvements will look like. So sidewalk and bike path and new paved streets and marked crossings and all the things that make life more pleasant. So I'm done with that one. This is the level of investment that we're making over the next 5 years. So $530 million, so $500 million over the next 5 years. You'll notice where the greatest levels of investment are. In the next 3 years alone, we'll be doing, this is the majority of the work that you'll see in East Portland will be over the next 3 years, but we'll be doing about $125 million in East Portland alone, which is an area that has historically been underserved and infrastructure has been lacking there. Also in far North Portland. So that's a map that we can share. If you'd like to have it, I can give that to you. Not a big deal. But we have a lot of work to do and not a lot of time to do it. And everybody's trying to build things. Yes.
Just a quick question. You had mentioned that 3.3 million out of the big 25 million was contributed by PBOT. So when you assign transportation investment value, where does the number come from? Is it that 3.3 million that PBOT pitched in, or is it the value of the transportation?
No, it's based on our capital improvement program. So that would be based on the 3 million. So the 33 million that you see here, yes, that includes Southwest Capitol Highway, but includes a lot of other improvements as well. So that's only 3 million of that. Yes, sir.
So the metro transportation projects that you partner with them, you guys are the ones that actually implement the project.
We get a grant from Metro and we then deliver their project, just like ODOT, we get grants. That's right.
Metro, you
Mhm.
guys will be implementing it and contributing some portion.
Some portion, but the lion's share comes from them, yes. Yes.
This is like outside of like new measures and stuff that probably will.
This is inclusive of things like the Fixing Our Streets gas tax. This does not include T2020, some of the new things that we're talking
like
about
new
now.
stuff.
Yeah, this is all existing money that we know we have identified. Okay, ready for the next one? So this is a chart that talks about how long it takes to do a project. If it's a simple paving project, excuse me, just a simple project, I shouldn't say paving. If it's a simple project, it can take as little as 3 months, but as much as 1 year for a simple project, for a crossing, because there are a number of things that go into getting to that 3 months to 1 year. If it's a large capital project, it can take anywhere from 1 to 10 years just in planning and project development. For those of you who live in North Portland, the intersection of Martin Luther King and Columbia Highway, 10 years for that intersection to be planned. 10, I've said this before, but if I were the project manager, I would jump off the top of the Portland building and cut my throat on the way going down. Because it took 10 years and he worked on that project the whole 10 of the 12 years that he's been with the Bureau, yes.
What is like the difference between a big project and a small project?
The amount of money.
25 versus like 75 million or like?
It's up to about 350, 400,000 would constitute small. Anything larger than that is considered a large capital project. Designing often is where we have the greatest level of challenge, and I'm going to wrap up in just a second. But when we design a project or we take a concept out, we go to the community, we go to an open house, we share what we've come up with. We say, don't you think it's great? People say, no, we hate it. So we got to go back to 30% or go back to 60% and redesign and redesign and redesign. And in Portland, unlike in other places, very, 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 very involved citizenry and who speak with very loud and unified voices. And so we do need to pay attention to that. So it causes a project to take longer. Why that's important for you to know is if we go on to the next one, construction is usually pretty predictable, closeout's pretty predictable. These are the things that you need to know. If we are in design, which kind of goes on all year round, and we don't finish a design in time to bid a project in the fall so that we can build the project when it's not raining, we might miss a whole construction year because we're having more and more conversation. And then you're complaining because we haven't finished, but it's because we're engaging. And I'm not blaming you, I'm just saying that there are opportunities for us to better understand the process so that we can be better advocates and understand when we should be inserting ourselves in conversations to ensure that we're getting the outcomes that we need. But this is when we try to build everything. So if it's super busy in the summer, that's why. And if you see people working all night, every night up until Sunday when it's going to start raining for the next 6 weeks, that's why, because we are going to have to shut it down after that because you can't do most work when it's raining or cold. Okay, so those are our funding sources. You'll notice I put general fund second to last, and it probably should be last. As I mentioned, we only get about $17 out of every 3,000 to do transportation work. So most of our work is funded by grants and other relationships that we have with other partners. That's all I have. Certainly, we can have time for questions, but I don't want to take time away from Tamika, who has more to share from a different perspective. And I want to hand this off so that we can keep it moving. I'm happy to answer questions, but I want to make sure that we get the meat of our conversation.
I'll be really short, just so we can spend more time on questions. Okay. Oh no, I did it wrong.
On the other side.
Yep. Got it. Really, I understand this. So I'll stand out of the light. So I think I was just going to talk about a little bit about who I am, what I do, and why I do what I do. We don't have enough time for that, and so I'll try to keep it I'll try to keep it really short, and then I'm happy to answer questions as we go. So I will say that, you know, for me, I was never a person who cared about transportation because I thought transportation is the best thing ever. I think, you know, I went to law school, I was a lawyer, hated that. And when I moved to LA for my girlfriend, then now my wife, I had a friend who got me into riding my bike. And I think for me, that was really transformative. And that was really transformative because I moved to LA. I'm not from LA, I'm from Nebraska, a much smaller place. And when I moved to LA, I hated it. I just thought people were in their cars all the time. I didn't really get it. And for me, when I first started riding my bike, that's when I actually felt like I got to know a place. And I think that's very true for people who take public transportation, for people who walk, for people who bike. We just know our cities in different ways. We know our neighbors in different ways. We know the smells and the feels and the things to see and do. And I think for me, that really opened my eyes up to this whole other world of transportation. I was also, as a lawyer, was a civil rights lawyer. And so I focused on discrimination laws. And I think for me, once my mind was open to urban planning, I realized what an important tool it was in changing systematic oppression and racism. I realized that there was this whole profession that no one ever told me about when I was like, I care about civil rights. No one was like, you should be an urban planner. You should ride your bike everywhere. Those things, like, we don't think about those things together. But I think the way that we build cities, the way that we build places and make people feel a sense of place has been a profession that has largely excluded some people. And I think that really bears fruit in our built environment. Who's included, who's excluded? What does it mean to be a person with a disability or mobility challenges? What does it mean to be a person of color? What does it mean to be low income? You know, when your number one concern is streetlights, that says something about the experience you have, and that could be because you're in a low-income community without streetlights. That could be because you're a woman who knows a different feeling when you're walking alone on a street at night without lights. And so I think for me, transportation was this great meeting place where things that we just care about as people, things that just matter for us as people, and a lot of that is just connecting to other people. It is this profession and this space where all of that comes together. And I think all of that comes together through people who have really fancy degrees and technical knowledge. But I think a lot of what I love about transportation is a lot of it is also intuitive. A lot of it is about emotional intelligence and caring and being thoughtful and thinking through how something might be intended to work, but how it might actually work, and taking the time to understand that. I think it's really hard to do that in transportation because we're on budgets, as we just saw, we're on timelines, and those of us who do this work as professionals are operating at a different pace and a different schedule than the people who are impacted by the work. And I think that is something we still haven't figured out. At Toole Design, I'm a private consultant, and my job as our director of equity and inclusion is very undefined. But I will say that it is supposed to be both internal facing and external facing. So that means if there's a project in a low income community and they're like, oh, we got to talk to Black people, like, I'm a person that people reach out to and say, like, what do we do? And similarly, if we're as a firm trying to think about like who we're hiring, what our policies are, I'm also working on internal things. And I think what's been really difficult for people as conversations around transportation justice and transportation equity have come up is that everyone wants to see the big splashy wins. and on the project side, that may be like a project where everyone wins and everyone's happy. But as we said in the activity earlier, like that's really, really hard. In the internal sense, right? It's like, you've been here a year, have our diverse hiring numbers gone up? And that's not really how transportation justice works. Like when you're trying to do work which is based in an understanding that for centuries there has been oppression and using land to keep certain people othered and oppressed and segregated and without resources, then this thought that you will have a ton of quick victories, like they're just not congruent with each other. And again, that's really hard when you're doing work which is formulated on spending certain dollars in certain time periods. And so I think, you know, what that means when you think about transportation justice is that this work is inherently hard. And I think that is really overwhelming to people. When you think about trying to solve justice problems and solve mobility problems and do them all on a certain budget and a certain timeline, all of that feels really overwhelming. And so, you know, I'll just end by saying, in transportation, we've been doing more and more with technology and with technology firms. And part of that is because there's things like scooters, which companies like Uber and Lyft, who are at their core, no matter what they want you to believe about being transportation companies. And I think in many ways they are. And I know a lot of people who work there who care passionately about transportation, but there are also tech companies who have a lot of people who care compassionately and deeply about tech. And I think often what's happened when these innovators come in and disrupt a system is folks who are like more traditional transportation folks get a little riled up and they're like, you know, what do we do about this thing? And I think it's the same thing when you're talking about equity, like it's something new. And so people are like, what do we do about this thing? And whether or not you're talking about hundreds of scooters on a sidewalk or angry community members who are talking about racism and gentrification and displacement, those are new things for our transportation profession. They're not new in the sense that they're just being talked about for the first time. They're new in the sense that for the first time, people are really trying to authentically struggle with them. And I think sometimes on that transportation tech front, we like to think, well, we have to figure it out, but it's so different. And I think that tech and transportation actually have a lot of similarities. I think when you think of what makes tech successful, for me, I've been telling people, I think about my financial advisor. We have a financial advisor because my wife makes a lot of money. She's a partner at a law firm. Thank God one of us stayed in the profession. I don't make a lot of money. And she makes me go to this financial advisor with her because I'm not great with money. But I asked this financial advisor, I said, you know, we work so hard. When are we going to be wealthy? And she said, she's very straightforward. And she just looked at me and she goes, oh, Tamika, you'll never be wealthy. In this country, wealth isn't because of hard work. It's from inheriting it. And that's how you get wealthy. However, because you have me, I've made you get life insurance. And if something ever happens to you or Kelly, your son will be fine because he'll inherit money. And she moved on to like the next thing, which was, why do we spend so much on Postmates? And then I was like, wait a minute. Let's go back to that. Like, that can't be the only way you can get wealthy. Like, I'm fucked. Like, what am I going to do? And she's like, she's thoughtful. So she stopped and paused and she said, well, if you think about a lot of like young, new money people, they are people who have taken big risk on themselves. And so she started listing all of these tech people who have taken big risk on themselves. And for me, that's where I made the connection to transportation, because it's not just that these tech people who have gotten rich take big risk on themselves. I think the other thing they do is have the ability to imagine something that doesn't yet exist. And that's exactly what we do in transportation work. We are trying to imagine things that don't yet exist. Now, we've been doing that from the beginning, whether or not you're talking about airplanes and the Wright brothers, or whether or not you're talking about a railroad that goes across the whole country. We also happen to, if you take that railroad example, or really any transportation example, there are certain people who get the like high of thinking about that thing that's not there and creating it. And then there are the people's backs who those dreams and visions are built on. And if you think about who we know, it was like displaced for the railroad, who like the people of color who had to build the railroad, right? Like these things have always been happening. But if we can acknowledge that, but still see that like at our core, we're still trying to bet on something and create something that we don't yet know exists, I think that's the big part of our jobs in transportation. And I think it's something that allows us hopefully to start working more with tech folks and thinking of each other more as partners and colleagues, but also to work more with folks of color. Because the last thing I will say, and then we can open it up a little bit, the last thing I will say is just that as I was sitting there thinking with my financial planner, I'm like, well, this is crazy. All of the people you named are white men, but of course they're white men, because those are the people who have like the time and the space to think about things they haven't yet seen and create them. And those are also the people who can take more risk, because if they take a risk, everybody's not going to judge their whole group of people about it. And I was like, there's not folks of color who get to do that. And then I thought about it more and I was like, well, that's actually not true, right? My dad had 14 brothers and sisters. He grew up in the projects in Omaha, Nebraska. He sold drugs. He carried a gun just in case someone shot first that he could shoot first. And he lived this life where no one had ever told him that he could be something different than that. But in order to have a daughter who went to Stanford Law School, in order to join the military and to have a way different life than he ever imagined, to be doing really well, his house is way bigger than mine. I mean, part of that is living in Omaha, but he has really changed from where he grew up in the projects. And the reason is because he believed in something that someone said doesn't exist, something he had never seen, and he made it happen. And so whether or not we're talking about tech people, whether or not we're talking about transportation people, or whether or not we're talking about people of color who actually, I think more than any other groups, have to imagine things they've never seen and make them happen. Whether or not that means leaving their country, whether or not that means figuring out how to fight through other people saying they can or can't do things. And so that's why I think I'm so passionate about this work and how it all fits together for me. Because as a person of color, I've always had to imagine things that people said didn't exist, or imagine things that when I see what I want, the people who are doing them don't look like me, and I have to figure out how to make them happen. And I love bringing that to transportation, where we're also trying to create things that are going to help people and bring people together and hopefully not continue to perpetuate keeping them apart, but thinking about things that never existed before. And so I think when we think about the practical, like how does government work? How do we plug in? I think what's really important for you all as you leave this class, because I know it's almost over, is you think about the projects you want to create. Don't get overwhelmed by the obstacles that are there or by why it can't happen. Force yourself to always be thinking about that dream, that vision that doesn't yet exist, and how you can bring other people in to help them have that same vision, and bet on yourself that you can make that happen. I think that's it. I think we only have 5 minutes for questions at this point.
Time is class at 8:35? Well, 8:40, so you could go for 10 minutes.
I thought you needed some time.
What do you- I usually
Let's see how
don't-
questions go.
Let's see how they go.
Do you want to come up?
Yeah. Let's see how questions
So
go.
any questions for me or Millicent or even Sarah?
But I say I'm here. She is not. So you can reach me anytime. Not that she can't reach you, but I would encourage you to ask those tough philosophical questions around how we intend to move this transportation industry forward with you as a player. While Tamika is here in person with you, I am literally 3 blocks away, and we can set up time for coffee and talk about some of those other specifics around project design and how we can be working together to improve communities. So I'll stay up here, but yes, you have a question, and I'm not sure who it's for.
Well, first for you and then for Tamika.
Okay.
Because yours is a yes or no. Can you give me the budget for the project that's currently ongoing?
Yes. Okay. Sadly, no, all of that.
Yes, but then of course I'm gonna ask you to help me change it.
In a good way? You want more money for it?
Well, I pretty much figure there is no more money, but I want to take it from one thing and do it to another.
Got it, okay. Not
So-
impossible. People think things are impossible with transportation, and they're also not impossible. Things can be moved, just as we built it, we can remove it. And so just because we've identified a location where we want to make an investment, doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best place. And if we have alternatives that we need to consider, we're happy to do that. So.
Riverside Bridge was planned without plastic ones.
Oh, that's
Suddenly,
Multnomah County.
plastic ones ended up on.
That's.
I'm just saying as an example that.
Okay,
suddenly-
we only have a few minutes.
Sorry.
Okay, question for Tamika.
Tamika,
we're gonna
when
move on.
somebody comes to you with a great win-win, we all won project, do you tell them that they just didn't look?
I want to believe that there are projects where everyone wins, because I think part of the like political climate and things that are tough right now is that we are so divisive. It's like them and us and winners and losers, and so I don't like to foreclose the idea that there could be a win-win situation. I just happen to be in a lot of groups where I don't ever win. Like I'm a very big New York Yankees fan, and it always surprises people. And I'm always like, look, like I'm a queer Black woman. Like I never win. Like just once I want to be on the team that just like has all the money and does all the things. And so I think it's hard for me to believe that there's a win-win. And I also think one of the things we do with outreach and engagement that is wrong is I used to work at a parks organization, and it is very much like an episode of Parks and Rec. Like the community meeting, any of us who have been to a community meeting on any side of it, you know how that goes. And I think that because we don't want to let community down, we try to create win-wins when they're not there. And I think what people don't realize is a community member may be mad at you if you say, no, we're not going to do this thing. Like we've compromised, we're doing the best we can for you, but like we're going to prioritize this mode, or we're going to prioritize safety, not this or that or whatever it is. Like people may be mad, but they're even more upset if you go in and say, it's going to be fine, everybody's going to get what they want, and then that doesn't happen. And so I think sometimes our inability to be direct and honest with people is based on this idea that there are many people, it's a natural human thing, who want everybody to like them. And I think when you do this work, you have to get comfortable really quickly with the idea that everyone's not going to like you, and you don't need everyone to like you. You need people to know that when you talk to them, that you're being honest, that they can trust that you're thoughtful, but that you're not always going to try to make them like you. And I think that's way more effective. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So, and it's kind of a big question, but like, how did you get to be like a transportation planner? Because like, that's like literally my dream. Like, I'm not going to cry. I just like loved your speech. It was so good. But like I often feel like I don't know the jargon and like a little bit like not smart enough to do it. And I'm just like curious about like what some of the things that you did like that got you to where you are.
Do you want to give a short answer to that too?
Well, I'm not a transportation planner either. I started working in transportation 2 years and 10 months ago. I worked in public service, and I fixed things. I fixed broken things. And so I worked hard where I was, and I paid attention to what was happening around me and learned and connected with people in the industry. And so the reason that I'm here is because I knew former director Leah Treat, who knew me to be a problem solver in Washington, D.C. And so as much as it's what you know, and I don't want to minimize needing to know a lot of things, but it is also in relationships, not just who you know, it's in relationships. And it's in the hard work and putting in and demonstrating a commitment to community that people will see. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your background is. If they see that commitment and that passion, that's what people would rather have. I'd rather have someone who's passionate about getting something done and sees the value in the work that's being done than having someone who's got 10 degrees and 15 certifications, but can't engage in a way that demonstrates a level of compassion, caring, understanding, and urgency around how we are going to work to transform, improve, create safe spaces for everyone. So
Yeah.
don't say what you said again.
Okay.
Okay.
I thought you would have a good answer for that, so I'm glad I asked. I totally agree with all of that. I think my answer would first be that I don't think I'm a transportation planner. Like that, like I would self-identify as many things, but even when I'm like filling out a form and they say profession, I still put like attorney, because I just like I don't necessarily think of myself as a transportation planner. And so I think what I did is I found something that I was passionate about. I found, like, I think much like many of the people in this room, like I was just an everyday person who was an attorney, but like really liked riding my bike, and then just like learned more about it and went to more community meetings and went to more workshops, and then like just put myself out there and found ways to get engaged. And I think relationships is really important, right? Like when I was at the Bike Coalition, our #1 volunteer was a wedding photographer who just came and said, I love bikes. And so took a ton of pictures, and then decided she wanted to go to school, got her planning degree, and like now works for the state transportation agency, and really feels like the connection she made at the Bike Coalition had done that. And the last thing I'll say is like, be okay knowing that we all have imposter syndrome, right? Like, because I'm not trained as a planner, my resume is very different than everyone at Toole Design. Like, I think technically my title is higher than Sarah's, but Sarah knows way more about transportation than I do, in a technical sense. But I think, like, you know, but as we had this meeting today with all of the directors of all of our Western offices in Portland, and the whole time I was just texting my wife and I was like, I don't feel like I belong here. Like, this is really uncomfortable to me. Like, I'm one of 2 people of color in the room. I'm the only Black person. And like, I don't feel valued. I don't feel like I have the same training. Like, I don't fit here. Like, I love my coworkers. They're all really smart. We're doing cool shit. But like, I just don't fit, right? And like, you need those people in your life who you can say that to and who can build you back up and like send you back into the game, right? And so I think you need to be okay knowing that we all have those doubts, but that's another reason relationships are important. They're really important to help you get jobs, but they're also really important that you have people you trust who you can be yourself with, and they can say to you like, no, you're here, you're taking time out of your night, and you know more than a lot of people, you can do this. And never be afraid to surround yourself with cheerleaders, because that's a really important part of getting to do this work. Because there are many times you're going to get knocked down, whether it's at a community meeting or a staff meeting, and you need people who know why you care and whether or not you would call yourself a planner. Like, if you care about these issues and if you're committed and you want to do the work, then you can do the work.
If I could add just a little bit to that, being somebody who actually, I guess, has a degree in planning. I would say the most useful job I ever had to get me to where I am right now was I was the head cook on a cattle ranch. And that, yeah, where I had to learn how to like wrangle horses and cook for 40 people, having never cooked before. And it's all about the problem solving, and also all about those relationships and how you take a problem that you've never encountered before and calmly solve it. And another big piece, if this is something where you're saying, you know, I want to do this as a profession, Portland is a really hard place to be a beginner at urban planning, because there's a lot of people that have been doing it for a long time. You go to any conference and you say you're from Portland, and they're like, oh, Portland, you guys just do things. Like you're, I mean, it's a really great confidence booster when you go to community meetings here and everybody's like, you're doing it wrong. Just go to a conference and you'll feel better after that conference. But if you're really like, I want to do this as a profession, and you're flexible, move to Omaha. That's the way to go. That was like our advice from grad school. I came out at a time where there were like no jobs, and everybody was saying, find a small town, because they're the ones where if you're a planner there, you'll get to do everything. You'll get to do the permitting, the building. Like if you have the drive and a bit of knowledge, like they will put you in charge. That being in Portland is a really hard place because there is a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and also like honestly, a very critical community that is not afraid to be critical. And so it is a hard place to gain confidence in the profession, but I think Tamika's right. And Millicent, like surround yourself with the relationships that work and maintain them, and make sure that you have those cheerleaders surrounding you to bump you up when you need it.
I say I don't know at least 50 times a day. There's a person on my team who's like, well, what about so-and-so? I don't know. And I said, I can help you figure it out. I don't know. I don't know. And at this point in my career, I'm like, I'm also not going to try to know it because I don't have to know how to work that system there. I need to know how to do that, but I don't need to know how to do that. So I'm in a different place completely because I care about things, but it's a different, I'm in a different space. I'm hopefully causing people to want to come into the profession and providing them framing and mentorship and opportunities to show up and come to the meeting and help me to present on Southwest Capitol Highway. I'm serious. So that you can get practice. But I agree with Sara. Small town work, you literally learn how to do everything, and that builds your resume. That builds your knowledge base in ways that being in a larger city, especially in a Portland, you're not going to necessarily have the opportunity. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but you know.
But you don't have to go as far as Omaha.
But Omaha's great. You can go to the coast.
You can go anywhere you want outside of Portland. But no, Portland's a great place to learn this stuff. This class, I think, has opened doors to me in so many ways, as well as it is to you. Any circles. So.
Andrew?
Due to time, I'll just ask her after class unless I can, but I can't wait until.
Go ahead. Just one more. Just one more.
You can make this a quick question. Also, if you had to create a Black Transportation Academy, what would be the top 3 factors that you would want to discuss?
For Black Transportation Academy?
Yes.
Would it be for like people in the profession?
No.
People in the community?
Yes.
May I?
Yes.
I don't want to answer the question. I want to explain to you.
I just want to hear her.
The goal is to have an academy where members of the community can come. That's not necessarily the 10-week commitment that this class is, but they can learn the jargon. They can learn how to engage in conversations and not do it from a position of anger and fear and be reactionary, but rather to be proactive. So he wants to prepare the community.
So it's not the answer you want, but what I always say is like we're constantly trying to train community to speak our language, and that to me is like a false setup to begin with. Like, why are we training them to speak our language instead of training people in our profession to speak to the community? Because for me to learn how to speak this language, and the joke I always say is like, you know, when I went to like a predominantly white institution at Stanford, like I had to figure out what NPR was and like listen to it and like be informed. And like we're constantly putting the onus, and like, no, like I want a white planner to come to the Black Transportation Academy that is my like barbecue in my hood and like figure out how to be comfortable. So my first answer would be like, I would flip it on its head. And I would say that I would try to train the people who are currently in the profession to do the work. Now, because power dynamics are as they are, and like, you know, that's more of a like, you can't dismantle the master's house with his tools. So like, that's what I truly believe. But in the meanwhile, while we're like trying to dismantle the house, we're also like still in the house. And if we're still in the house for now, then I think the academy, like, one has to cover like some sort of like healing. And like, I'm not, you know, I'm not necessarily like a super feely person, but once you start talking about transportation work with people of color, like, there's no way to not feel pain. There's no way to not feel the pain of the history that has impacted our people and continues to oppress us. And there's no way to not feel pain with things that you can't ignore and you see so clearly, but other people just don't see. And so like, I think that would be number one. Like, you have to create some space for folks to have those feelings and feel those feelings, but then move forward. And I think when you move forward, there would be, whenever I do trainings, I spend a ton of time on definitions, because there just has to be some basic, like, this is what we mean when we're saying this thing, and this is what it looks like. And then the other thing that I think for any, not just transportation planning, but I think for anyone who wants to engage in the public process, we spend a lot of time, or maybe not enough, like, but I think it's common sense that we think of like, what are the steps to take to get to where we want to get. And I think that's important for people to know. But to simplify it, people always need to know how many people can say yes and make this thing happen, and how many people can say no and shut it down. And that's like just really, really key. Like, are you in a strong mayor city, or if the mayor says this is going to happen, it's going to happen? And if you're not, who are all of the people who can shut it down? And so some people describe that as power mapping, but I think it's just this very simple, like, who can say yes and it'll get done, and who can say no and just completely slow it down. And I think that's a number one thing that people really have to understand. And I think especially if you're doing a Black academy, again, you have to create space to talk about like the race and power dynamics inherent and all of that. And you have to help people understand the difference between power over people and having power with people, and how to like bring power up with other folks.
Appreciate it, thanks.
That's it.
Yep.
So everybody's going to happy hour, right?
Yeah.
Oh, is everybody drinking?
You're welcome to do that as well,
I'll leave my project up for another 5 minutes if anybody wants to look at it.